One of the reasons that I talked about freedom of speech today is not just because it's really easy for me to do so, having just done a lot of work on it, but I think it would be a fantastic topic for the LDP to be both really, really popular with. I think it's a huge issue. We get a lot of feedback on freedom of speech, but it's something that you can be a bit aggressive and you can push the window out quite far if you start talking about those, what is incitement to violence, what is defamation, all that sort of thing. But we'd be more than happy to talk, but it's not our shtick. It's sort of writing policy.
Just the shift in sentiment towards free speech, because I kind of get a sense that there has been a shift in sentiment, and there is more forces mobilised against them than perhaps there was in the past. To what extent do you think that relates to the traditional role of the media being challenged by the likes of bloggers and social media and all those sorts of things? Is it really a sort of rent-seeking response to these new startup alternative viewpoints?
I think from the perspective of the regulators, particularly the Press Council, I think that's absolutely right. One of the problems that I see infects the debate over freedom of speech is a consequence of the history of freedom of speech, and particularly freedom of the press, really built up this idea of the media being the bulwark of democracy. We prevent tyranny and all that sort of thing. And through that idea, there's become a philosophy where the media is actually just a public service. And so when all these regulators and all these lefty journalists see Bolt or some shock jock ranting and raving, or not to say that they particularly rant and rave, but they see them mounting aggressive arguments, perhaps they don't think those are accurate. They think that that is a breach of the basic foundation of the free press, rather than the basic foundation of freedom of speech. And that has led us, I think, to where we are today, where freedom of the press, in the mind of a lot of scholars and journalists, is only applicable to the good press, the quality press, the broadsheets. I think that's the short-term drive behind this, and the explosion of media is a factor in that too.
I'm going to ask a question because I'm staying at the front here. How would you answer the criticisms coming out of the Leveson inquiry in the UK regarding they're characterising it as tabloid journalism versus responsible journalism, and phone hacking and bribing coppers and privacy issues and so forth? How do you answer those ones?
I mean, there's a couple of issues there. The things they were doing is illegal. Absolutely. It's illegal to phone hack. The reason that it became such a scandal is because it's both illegal to phone hack and the cops are involved. There's a much more basic problem with the Leveson inquiry is the parallel investigation going on at the moment, which is how the police were involved. If you can't trust the police to uphold the law, then you haven't got any chance. Everything else, all the actors coming out and talking about how the tabloids are so mean, that's a sideshow, and that's for journalism academics to get really excited by. But I think from a public policy perspective, some of what the UK papers were doing is a bit yuck, and we don't have to think they're a good thing, but the real issue is the police.
If we go back about 110 years ago, when this country was officially recognised as a country, we were actually a federation, not a democracy. We used democratic principles. Do you feel our forefathers, for instance, dropped the ball by not actually instituting a Bill of Rights, perhaps outlining unalienable rights, which were predetermined back then as meaning given to us by our Creator? Do you think we could address this today?
Yeah, I'm of two minds about a Bill of Rights. It's lovely. Any restriction on government is a good thing. And particularly in the First Amendment question, when we learn how powerful the First Amendment has actually been. But bear in mind, it's only been powerful for about 50% of its operation. The First Amendment really didn't mean much during the 19th century. It only started to do so because of a number of post-First World War decisions. Bill of Rights are sometimes a useful tool to get the outcomes you want, but they by no means guarantee it. And sometimes they're a joke. I mean, if you look at, you know that from just looking at the Australian Constitution, which outlines a pretty clear system of government that looks nothing like it does today. So they can be a useful tool. If you were to impose a Bill of Rights now, obviously you'd be bringing, most likely it'd be my bet, you'd be bringing a lot of awful provisions with yourself as well, because the human rights lobby don't have in mind freedom of speech when they're arguing for that sort of thing. They have in mind, you know, restrictions on offensive speech and yada, 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 you know, right to education and all these sorts of things. And I would put money on any Bill of Rights that even said we have an unlimited right to freedom of expression to be interpreted exactly as the status quo. We have freedom of expression with the exceptions of here's this huge list of stuff. So yeah, it'd be nice and it's an interesting counterfactual, but I don't think it's going to get us there.
Now, just on the IPA, how do you deal with the tension between, crudely speaking, libertarians and conservatives? Everything I read of yours is pretty good libertarianism. Not everything I read of the IPA probably fits in that category, and some of it has a whiff of conservatism.
Sure.
Presumably internally there are debates.
Listen, the IPA is a free market think tank. We don't make any claims to be particularly libertarian or particularly conservative. And more importantly, we don't have many hard and fast policies. We don't have many hard and fast internal views. So I can go and write pretty much what I want as long as it's broadly holds to the free market values of the organisation. Because I'm a newspaper columnist and that sort of thing, you know, I get opportunities to write on drug law reform, which is not going to be an IPA position by any means, but is of interest to me. We're not hard and fast. We don't sit down and decide what is our position on, you know, the Australian Building and Construction Commission. We don't have those discussions. They'd be pointless. We all have our own interesting interpretations.
Clinton.
Yeah. I found really interesting what you were talking about, the origins of these restrictions from what essentially is the left and particularly the Greens, because I think nowadays people are against censorship. Okay, I'm not going to Labor for Steve. I'm not going to vote for Labor. This was on they're all too conservative. And they have petition laws as well and counterism. So they go to the Greens. But from what you're saying, you're quite different narrative. The Greens are any worse. Like, I don't think even Labor and Liberal, it's just that license.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, but we need that's not the perception of it. There's a similar thing.
That's absolutely right, and
you can start fighting that. Maybe not to do it. That's great. But yeah, I found the issues, we need issues where neither Labor, Liberal, or Green support us, and got to find issues where one of the parties there is big trouble. We get issues where no one else is out there. We can start getting traction. So you wouldn't be able to get that traction through the you get through past the Greens.
I like the Greens on this. Sorry, not like, but they're funny. The Greens on this issue, particularly on internet censorship, in 2004, so before we were really talking energetically about an internet filter, they had a policy that opposed internet censorship, but on the other hand, argued for government intervention to restore the balance. There wasn't enough gay and lesbian material on the internet, apparently. So they wanted government to, you know, a public broadcaster for the internet, a gay public broadcaster for the internet was their policy. It was very weird, and of course they are terrible on these more basic questions of hate speech and all that sort of thing, which as we know is are the new trend in attacks on freedom of expression. The Greens annoy me as much as they annoy you guys, no doubt, because what we do, we find that, you know, I agree with them on some issues, but you realise that they're coming from a totally different direction, and that critically undermines some of their policy positions.
Phil?
After the Andrew Bolt case, Tony Abbott allegedly made some comments about, oh, when we enter power, we're going to change that law, but he wasn't very definite. Do you know of any political parties or even as Australian politicians who have actually come out and been pretty explicit about getting rid of all those laws?
But Brandis was talking about getting rid of them. I don't know what stage of the policy-making process it is, but he was. And was pretty explicit about it. We did a big newspaper ad. We got a number of politicians, some of which are quite up and coming, arguing against restrictions on freedom of speech. I think there's a view within the Liberal Party that something could happen. I have very little optimism that it will.
John Kelly?
Just my personal thoughts with human rights laws, more broadly speaking, human rights. I've noticed they're basically they're useful for a lot of things, but not really for enforcing or protecting human rights. Looking at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Convention on
the civil and political rights, and then there's the social and cultural rights.
Most of those, when you read them, it's like, oh, people have the right to do this, unless it's, the government doesn't like it, basically.
Yeah.
And so every one of them has this exception. You go, well, okay, in other words, I don't really have that right.
There's a great one in the Victorian Charter, which says that we have the right to property, or have the right to not have our property taken unless it's in the public interest.
Yeah, that's right. So they're all like that. And then you look at the Anti-Discrimination Act here. It was, there's no discrimination until the government wanted to do the Northern Territory Intervention, in which case they repealed that bit, and then they went and intervened. So, and the other year there was the whole discussion about should there be a Human Rights Act, and I think the Human Rights Act isn't worth the paper it's written on, because as soon as the government wants to do something different, they'll repeal it. And I think that's what I see as the biggest benefit of having a human rights amendment to a constitution, is because it's initiated by the people, and of course it's still in the hands of the judges to interpret that, but at least it's something that comes from the people and the government can't just repeal.
Yeah, as I said, my ambiguity on this issue is based exactly on that. In Australia, it seems that the legislature wins all the time, no question. But in the US, there are some great stories of the First Amendment. As I said, graphic warnings on cigarette packets. It didn't stand up to First Amendment scrutiny. Now that must have blindsided a lot of people, but it does demonstrate that a well-crafted, if you get the precedent correct, everything like that, it can actually have a beneficial effect. I just don't think if you were to impose it today that we could necessarily assume that benefit happened.